Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Intro to Copy Editing, presented by Amy J. Schneider. First order of business, very quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed in the following webinar are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official policies or views of Editors Canada or its members. I will now proceed with the land acknowledgement. Editors Canada is on and is grateful to work on treaty lands and territory of the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada. We are all treaty people and accept our responsibility to honor all our relations. We encourage you to learn more about the Indigenous cultures, territories, and the effects of colonization in your region. I am very pleased to welcome Amy J. Schneider, owner of Feather Schneider Editorial Services. Amy has copy edited over 600 novels for traditional publishers, including series and bestsellers. She is the author of The Chicago Guide to Copyediting Fiction, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2023. Amy has written and spoken about copy editing fiction and other topics for editorial associations in multiple countries. So welcome, Amy. Please take it away.
Thank you, Shannon. That's a wonderful introduction. I'm just going to launch right into things, everyone. I wish I could cover all the topics, but we've only got 45 minutes to cover a lot of stuff. So let's take it away. If you're just starting out, we just want to start with some intro references to get you started. These are all chock full of information and other resources, and this is by no means a complete list, but please put these in your toolbox and you will be well on your way. First of all, you'll need to be familiar with at least one style manual. Most clients will want you to follow a particular style guide, possibly in addition to their house style if they have one. Chicago manual style is most common in North America for general editing, but there are of course others, specialty manuals such as APA, AMA, and so on. You'll also need a good dictionary. Most clients, organizational clients, will have a house dictionary they want you to follow. Uh, Merriam-Webster's Collegiate is the most common in general editing in the United States. Although, of course, in Canada, you'll probably also need a Canadian dictionary, such as Canadian Oxford. You might also follow the OED. The Copy Editor's Handbook by Marilyn Schwartz and Amy Einsohn is a must for any editor, experienced or not. Please put it on your shelf. It's a comprehensive course all by itself. Another resource is Catherine O'More Clough's online copy editor's knowledge base, which is on her website. She's constantly adding to it and updating it. It will keep you busy for weeks, if not months. So definitely check that out online. If you are going to freelance, you need the copy editors, the Chicago Guide for Freelance Editors, which recently came out, also from U Chicago Press by Erin Brenner. Erin is the queen of freelance editorial business management, so definitely put that on your shelf. We're going to talk about conscious style and conscious language a little later. So you definitely need Karen Yin's book, The Conscious Style Guide. She also has a comprehensive website that you can spend a lot of time on. And last but not least, of course, my little yellow book. This webinar is a very basic overview, so if you have deeper questions about copy editing fiction, they are very likely to be covered in the book. So, speaking of copy editing fiction, let's move on to one of my favorite topics. Oh, that was a poorly written intro. I forgot I put this slide in. Okay, we'll talk about some basic business skills. If you're a freelancer or you're planning to freelance, you will need to wear some different hats. Obviously, you'll need editing skills. Even if you have the innate skills to be an editor, you'll need training, whether that's in-house experience with a publisher or some other organization. You might take webinars or classes or conference sessions given by a professional association, such as this one. You might take a certificate program offered by a university. And you'll find more information about those resources in the books and resources from the previous slide, which I will show again at the end of the presentation. Most important, you will also need some business skills. You'll need to market yourself in order to find clients. You can go to websites like Reedsy and Fiverr and Upwork. Those are a place to start, but they can often be irregular work and low paying. It can be better to build relationships and a network of regular clients who aren't just looking for the cheapest person. You will also need to learn how to handle business finances, setting your rates, invoicing, bookkeeping, doing your taxes, putting money aside for your taxes, budgeting for business expenses, doing your retirement planning, putting aside your own benefits for healthcare and things like that. Um, you will need to handle clients, negotiating fees and the scope of work, setting expectations, dealing with problem clients and problem situations. Those all need a little bit of massaging sometimes. You will need to manage your time. People often ask me, "Gee, you've been freelancing for so long. How do you manage your time and stay on track?" And I always tell them, if I ever figure it out, I'll let you know. So yeah, I do struggle with some of these things. Setting schedules, meeting deadlines, juggling multiple projects, handling schedule disruptions, whether it's tech errors or you get sick or something happens with your family or who knows what could happen. You also need to take time for your work-life balance. And you also need to make time for your professional development. Even once you get started, if you've been in it for 30 years like me, you still need to keep that development going. Keep taking those classes and webinars, keep learning new software and other skills. Work on your website and your branding and your marketing. You might need to make changes in the services that you offer or the clients that you serve or the clients you want to work for. You will also need some tech skills. You'll need to be your own IT department one way or another because you won't have that corporate guy coming in to swap out your computer if it goes bad. You'll need to keep your software and hardware up to date. You will need to keep up on editing specific software that helps you be more efficient and accurate. You will need to maintain a robust backup system for both hardware and software because a good backup will change an oh crap moment into oh well, and you just load your backup and carry on with your day. Um, you need to do basic troubleshooting and have a tech on call for the things that you yourself can't handle. So those are basically the skills of running an editing business. Definitely get Aaron Brenner's book. There's lots of details in there. I highly recommend that. So now we will go on to talk about copy editing fiction. So if any of you are already familiar with editing nonfiction, it's a little bit of a pivot to switch to fiction. Because fiction is not a presentation of facts, it's rather a vacation to another place or time or both. So you don't want to apply your grammar hammer to everything to impose a strict house style. There's much more flexibility, much more leeway in spelling, grammar, punctuation, in how we handle dialogue, especially because characters don't speak in Chicago style. We don't speak in formal textbook English 100% of the time. Fiction often breaks the rules in order to help paint that picture in the reader's mind. So, a skilled copy editor mostly lets the book be its own style guide. And the usual application of style is first comes the author's style, whether it's just for that standalone book or whether they've got an established canon from previous books. And then you would apply the client's house style if they have one. And then finally, last comes your official style manual, whether it's Chicago style or some other published style guide. So generally, you just let the author have their voice. They and their characters may say and do things differently than you would. If it's understandable and it's not blatantly wrong, just leave it alone. We also need to remember that different genres have different elements. For example, fantasy would have lots of special terms, lots of backstory, lots of world building, perhaps invented languages. Um, Military thrillers are going to have lots of technical info, lots of blood and gore, probably lots of spicy language. Um, Romance also has different levels of spice, and there's a certain formulaic story arc that they usually follow. And something to remember about genre is that it's okay to turn down genres that bother you, whether it's too much violence or too much sex or just doesn't interest you. You're free to tell clients, sorry, I don't work on that kind of project. Another important part of copy editing is to help readers maintain that suspension of disbelief, which means we don't let weird continuity errors, disrupt the story, get into the reader's brain, and pull them out of that escape. We've all noticed problems in novels because of either our own personal knowledge, of a certain place or a time or a profession or a hobby or a subject. And I'll cover this in more detail when I talk about building a fiction style sheet. So here we go about style sheets. So here's a process of how you would handle a manuscript when it first comes in. You've received it, you've reviewed your house style, you're ready to start. So on your first pass, you're just going to read it. I'm doing one of these right now. Just read the story. I just have my laptop sitting down, got some snacks. Um, just read through it, just like you would read any novel, and get to know the characters, the story, the author's style. Um, During this first pass, I would fix absolute errors only, things that are, obviously misspelled words, wrong word choice. I would also fix typographical things such as spaces before periods or quote marks that are backwards, bad paragraph breaks. Most of my clients are good with doing that type of typographical cleanup untracked because then it's something that the author does not have to look at and review and consider because it's just obviously something that has to be done. But I do have one client that wants absolutely everything tracked. So for them, I track everything and the author just has to deal with it. During this first reading pass, you will also note the level of detail you're dealing with. Are there lots of proper names? Is there lots of extensive convoluted history or multiple timelines or really detailed descriptions of things? Or is it pretty bare bones? Because that will give you an idea of what level of detail you're going to need to put on your style sheet. So that brings us to the main pass, which is the pass where you very carefully read word for word, make your style choices, and build your style sheet. So if you're completely new to editing, you may wonder, I've been talking about style sheets. What is a style sheet? So basically, a style sheet is a document that the copy editor compiles while editing that lists all of the style decisions and choices for that particular manuscript. So it's like a little mini dictionary for that particular work. Uh, it's a tool that helps the copy editor keep things consistent because you always refer back to it as you make choices or confirm that things conform to the choices you've already made. And it also provides a reference for everyone else who is going to work on that manuscript from that point forward, such as the author, the proofreader, the indexer, the designer, and so on. So during the main pass, you will make notes about things like the characters, the locations, and the timeline and plot, and we will go over all of these shortly. You will generally edit dialogue with a very light hand. So you're going to respect things like the character's diction or their accents or any regional grammar they may use. They may be hesitating in their speech or interrupt themselves or things like that. Also, especially in fiction, you want to be very tactful with your queries, questions that you write to the author. Be polite and professional. Ask about the author's intent rather than dictating, well, this needs to be this way or that way. You can explain how readers might stumble over the text and suggest fixes for problems if you can. And finally, you have your third pass, which is actually it's not really a full read through necessarily. Um, 99% of the time for me, it's just a bunch of little mini passes doing things like deflagging, which is cleaning up notes that you made to yourself or things you wanted to review when done. Maybe you wanted to look at all the chapter heads and make sure that they're formatted the same, or review all instances of a particular character's dialogue or things like that. You will run spell check and maybe run a consistency checker like Perfect It. You will review all your queries for typos, make sure they're tactful, delete any that you have already resolved, and then you'll save the final file to return to your client. And then you also want to review your style sheet, check for typos and things, finalize the format and the layout, and save it for submission along with the manuscript. Okay, so how I organize my fiction style sheets, I put them in basically four sections, which we will talk about right after this. I have a section on general style, which is things like numbers, punctuation, typography, abbreviations, the word list, same sort of things you'd have on a nonfiction style sheet. um, details about the characters, details about locations and places, and uh, a, a document that lists the timeline and the plot. So if you're really lucky, the author will include things like character bios or backstory or world building information in the manuscript, which is great because then you can just plop that on your style sheet and you know what the author intended and you can refer to that as you edit. You may also get a style sheet from a previous book by the same author if you're working with a publisher or if you're working with an author who has done previous books, whether it's a standalone or a previous book in that series. That will show their preferences. That will show the history of previous books they've done. So also add that to your style sheet before you begin so you have it as a reference. Okay, this is where we start diving into the style sheet itself. So we'll start out talking about numbers in the general style section. Um, Please note throughout any discussion of style sheet, all of the examples in purple are possible ways to treat various elements. This is by no means a style dictation. These are just examples of things you need to watch for, things to consider. How are you going to treat these? Um, so, for example, for time, a publisher may have a house style on how things are hyphenated. I have one that hyphenates certain time statements and others that don't. Um, is time general or exact, and how are you going to treat that? When you're mentioning someone's height, is it 5'3" or 5'3"? Are you hyphenating or not? How are you treating dates, whether they are spoken or maybe they're in the heading of a letter or on a news article or a telegram or something like that? How are we treating room numbers? Um, how are we treating numbers in dialogue? Now, there's a long-standing rule that we always spell out numbers in dialogue, but that could easily get clumsy and hard to read, and it just doesn't make all sense all the time. For example, things like phone numbers or dates or gun calibers. So you're going to have all kinds of different categories of numbers that you would keep as digits in dialogue. Some of that is covered in Chicago, some of that is covered in my book. Just always, when you see a number, always stop and think, is this the best way to treat this number? Um, and so we will move on. You're also going to consider punctuation. Some things you run into in fiction are when an author wants to omit the serial comma. Not very common, but it happens, in which case that might be another pass that you do. Some authors also are not fond of semicolons in fiction. That's a big trope that we hear about a lot. I feel that they have their use in fiction, and we don't want to sprinkle them everywhere, but if they help the reader, they serve a purpose. It's a legit punctuation mark, and let's use it when we need it. Um, Ellipses are usually only 3 dots in fiction, but not always. There are exceptions. And also on our first bullet point, you'll see that comma right before the closing quote mark, and she said. There's much variation in how that is used, whether it appears or not. Most publishers, in my experience, actually omit it. Chicago used to insist on it, but now they are allowing us to omit it again. So again, it's individual style choice. It's not a sacred rule. Look at the style that you're working with and follow that. Color terms, styles, and preferences for hyphenation may vary. And there's all kinds of different rules that authors will follow for that. Commas after or around to, either, and anyway, and sometimes though, and some other adverbs. Um, those rules may vary as well. Um, Exclamations, again, that comma may be there or not, or the author just simply may not care. You may have an instruction to follow the author's style, what they've done. And also watch for possessive of names ending in S. Usually we include the S. Sometimes an author says, no, I want to omit it. And also watch for those plurals of names ending in S. Those can get kind of tricky. Okay, when I talk about typography, I mean things like italics, Romans, small caps, use of quotation marks or not, capitalization, things like that. Um, so in dialogue, I prefer to keep quotes for spoken dialogue only, and italics for dialogue that isn't real. such as things that are mouthed or imagined or remembered, or descriptions of gestures and looks, like I gave him a go away stare, things like that. Um, but sometimes authors want uh, Roman with quotation marks or with hyphens for those phrasal adjectives, especially if it's a really long phrase. And so just here are some examples of some other things you might run into and are almost always on my style sheets: how you treat words, words as sounds, letters, letters as shapes, and so on. The examples here are typically how I do them, but again, it can vary. Also, think about how to style things that you can read, written things, signs, handwriting, text messages, and so on. It might be small caps. It might be capped in lowercase. It could be italic. It could be in quotes. It could be a character style, a word character style that is actually applied in the file. Um, you do want to be careful not to go too crazy with a whole bunch of different variations, like something different for each type of thing, because then it starts to look like a ransom note. Generally, context will help readers understand what's what. Um, Another common question is terms of address. People are often unsure whether generic terms of address should be capped or not. Um, a good general rule is that if you would refer to them to someone else by that name, you would cap it. So, for example, darling, you wouldn't say, "Is darling on her way here?" No, you wouldn't say that. It's a term of endearment. It's just generic, so you would lowercase it. Same thing with familial names. You would say, "Oh, where's grandma?" But you wouldn't say, "Is cousin coming?" You would refer to them by their name, so those would be lowercased. And then I always have a miscellaneous section. It's kind of a junk drawer a little bit. This is where I drop, for example, fictional elements that don't fit under characters or places, such as organizations or events, things like that. Um, I tend to group them rather than putting them in a big alphabetical list. So I might put all the clan names together, and all the names of wines together, because it helps me see how similar things are treated when I need to make a decision later on. You might be trying to remember how a certain clan name was treated, but if you can't remember which one you were thinking of, or you don't want to have to scroll through a big long list, if you've got all the clans together, you can look at that and see, oh, you can see how they're similar, and maybe you might change your mind later if you come across a more reasonable way to style it later on. And then finally, you have the general word list, which is pretty much on every style sheet. This would be for specific terms you would be looking for that aren't part of any particular category, maybe. Um, Generally, you would put all your generic dictionary words there, whether they're real or they're invented for the story. Um, on this slide, I have only a few examples of fiction-specific terms that might be on the word list, like the ancient mother and firekin. Um, Also, some other choices you might make, like which version of a verb are you going to use? How are certain dialogue forms treated? There are all kinds of different ways to spell whatcha. Is it whatcha or wudja or whadia, or choose one and stick with it? They might have different meanings depending on how they're spelled. Um, Slang and vulgar words often are not in the dictionary, so you have to make a choice. And also how are sounds rendered, both to make sense to the reader and also to accurately convey how they sound. So that is the end of the section on general style. Next, we will move on to characters. Come on, we're going to move to characters. There we go. Okay. Something I see a lot on style sheets that come to me that I did not create is I just see a big long list of character names, alphabetized, last name first, first name last. That's easy to refer to as far as finding a particular name, but it doesn't really help me see the relationships between people, and it doesn't help me catch things like someone has three brothers, but there are only two that are named, things like that. Or if Bob becomes Brad, that doesn't help me see that sort of thing. So I group people by affiliation, like all the members of a family together, or a group of coworkers, or neighbors, or members of an organization, or the servants, or the bad guys, or the vampires, or whatever. Um, I have heard that some publishers insist on an alphabetical list, so I haven't run into that myself. But if they did, I would just compile a separate alphabetical list and send that along too. So on this slide, we have some examples of other entities that might be included on a character list besides just regular named characters. For example, animals. Animals are characters too, and they have attributes. They are a certain breed or a certain color or an age, or they have a life history that you maybe need to know about. You might have sentient weapons and objects. Think about, like in the Lord of the Rings, you had Frodo's sting. That's a character. Or the Sorting Hat in Harry Potter. That's a character. You might have fictional deities or characters that aren't even named, but they still have characteristics and they might be referred to later. And we need to remember, did that bus driver had blonde hair or brown hair? I've also run into things like I think my favorite one was the mountain, which started out on my location page, but it turned into a person. So I had to put it on the character list, and I think I had it on both, and I had cross references and things. So watch out for things like that. There we go. Okay, so what sort of things are we noting about our characters on the style sheet? Basically, think about anything that could be contradicted later. So, you know, eye color can change. Someone's eyes are blue in the first 15 chapters and then suddenly they turn green. Or their height might change. Or do they wear glasses? What's their blood type if it's mentioned? Any sort of specific details like that. Things about their physical description, excuse me. Um, what are their pronouns? I always add those after the character name just for reference, because some names aren't obviously gendered, especially in fantasy. Some characters' gender is fluid. Some characters' gender is unspecified deliberately or not. I once got through a mystery novel. It was about two-thirds of the way through before a certain character's gender was even revealed, and it was part of the twist. And I was kind of surprised and shocked that I hadn't caught on to that person's gender had never been mentioned that whole time. So that was an interesting thing to discover. Uh, Also, look at things like right and left, people's ages or their birthdays or their relative ages and birthdays. That can be important in stories with a long timeline because sometimes those shift out of whack. Um, Look at changes in things like maybe their hair was longer and then they cut it, or people lost or gained weight, or things like that. You can catch relative references to things like height, like people looking up at people or towering over them, things like that. It's not something that's concrete that you might not catch it otherwise, but anything relative like that, say, could this be represented differently later? Also, we want to look at biographical facts about the person, their education, their abilities, things they do or don't do or can't do. Detailed things like phone numbers, addresses, email addresses, all those sorts of things. If you find contradictions, sometimes it's an easy fix. Like if a name is spelled one way 6 times and another way um, one time, then you can just fix the one that's different and go on. If it's a little more of an even trade, you might want to query the author and say, hey, which one of these spellings did you want to use? And sometimes you will run up on plot points that you really can't do much about. Um, I had one once where someone had a brother in the previous book, but in the current book, now they're an only child. Uh, there might be a way to fix that, there might not. That's something to query to the author and ask them if they want to fix it or just let it go. So here's a sample entry, very simplified, of what I might put on my style sheet. First, I have the person's name and any nicknames and his pronoun, and then his age and physical description, some of his biographical background. He was injured in his right thigh, and a relationship to another person. So he's known Elsa since she was a toddler, so we can't have him say, "Oh, I didn't know anything about you when you were a teenager." So that's something you would put on there to have for reference. Onward to places. Again, you would group things by their relation to each other, a planet and all the cities on it, or a city and then the main character's house and the secondary character's house, and then all the businesses that are downtown and things like that. Um, you want to check things about that against reality when you can. If they're real places, check to see that they're named correctly, that they're located correctly, that they're in the right place compared to other locations, that they existed at that time period. But also remember to allow for deliberate fictionalization. Sometimes authors, deliberately tweak things to make it fit their story and then put it in an author's note at the beginning or the end. And again, this is where you will know how much detail to record by your first pass. So, you might have a very detailed description of a place that people are only in once, so you won't need to refer back to that. But if it's a place that occurs again and again throughout the story, you'll want to make those notes so that you can make sure it's consistent throughout. You'll want to make note of things like cardinal directions, and it's not always outright statements of east, west, north, south. It could be where the sun is coming from, where the ocean is, what time of day is it, those sorts of things. Again, right and left is important. Make note of any proper nouns, again, whether they are real or fictional, and if they're real, fact check them. Business hours and regular events are important to know too. For example, things that happen at a certain location at a certain time of day, like school events or business hours. And those will tie into your timeline because they'll help you find plotting problems. Um, Consider how interiors are laid out. What is the decor? Um, what is the structure? What is the layout? What floor are things on? And also a common problem I see is that something's on the third floor. You only climb 2 flights of stairs to get there. And in reverse, if someone throws you out of a third floor window, you only fall 2 flights because you fall one floor to the second floor and another floor to the ground. Um, and then it gets really confusing if you get into British usage where the first floor is actually the ground floor, and then they start the first floor is on the second floor and up from there. So if you're doing something with a British flavor, watch out for that as well. For your exteriors, again, watch for those details. Make note of the architecture, the landscaping. Make sure that that kind of tree grows in that climate or at that time of year. Look at maps, or if it's a fictional place, draw a map. I did once a trilogy that all took place in one small town, and I kept a map throughout the whole thing, and I had to adjust it as more information came in, but it really helped me keep it straight on which houses were placed in relation to others. If the author provides a map, that's awesome too, because it can be really hard to visualize things sometimes. And distances also tie into the timeline. Is it possible to travel that far by that mode in the time given? Is that place really a 20-minute walk away, or is it only 5 minutes, or is it across the street and it's not going to take 20 minutes to get there? So it's all interrelated. So make sure you write down as much as you can. All right, come on. There we go. So here's an example of a places entry. Again, the name of the location, some general information about its location, some description of the interiors and what we can see out the windows and what's on what end of the building, so on. And finally, the timeline. Many of my clients ask me specifically to keep a timeline, even though I always do. Um, For a very simple timeline, you could do a chapter by chapter text description. It's good for general timelines without a lot of detail. However, if there is a lot of detail, I almost always lay it out like a calendar page with 7 columns, one for each day of the week, because it helps me keep track of when are weekdays, when are weekends, how do weeks and years go by. It gives me a visual. I'm a visual thinker, so that's what works for me. Um, so you'll want to track, obviously, plot things as they happen, make note of any historical events, double check those against a perpetual calendar, um, query them if you're unsure about how things are laid out. You may have some time references that are vague, things like a few days later, or you're not sure if this is a Tuesday. Just kind of put things where you think they fit, and you can always adjust them later. You also might want to put some kind of divider in between specific breaks in the time so that if there's a chunk that you need to move based on later information, you know where to start and stop that chunk in order to move it around. And that's been very helpful. Also, be mindful of when you have parallel timelines, such as when people are traveling and then they separate from each other and then they come back together. You can't have one group of people take 3 weeks to get somewhere that only takes the other group 3 days. You run into that a lot. Authors really struggle with timelines. So, if you can keep a good timeline, you can save the day. Same thing for flashbacks. Make sure that those sorts of things line up. So again, just as for characters and locations, keep track of any mention of time, whether it's fixed or relative, and it can be references to the seasons or the weather, or whether it's a school day or a work day, whether there are commuters. Those are all clues to what day are we on, or what is happening, and how does it work related to other things. Things like holidays or critical plot events. If the banquet is a week from Friday, make sure it happens on Friday, a week from Friday. Um, you can't be 35 in June and then 36 in October and then 37 in January. I had one novel where a character's birthday was in 3 different months and the entire plot was tied around her birthday. So, any references to those ages or times, um, definitely keep an eye on those, keep track of them, and query any discrepancies. So this is probably kind of tiny, but it kind of gives you an idea visually of what my timeline usually looks like. I've got little chapter numbers to show where things are happening. That gray line indicates a major break in the time between the prologue and the actual events of the story when it started. And there's an example of this. You can see more of this in my book. So if you want to see that, you can look in there. Dialogue is a big part of fiction. Again, it's so important to let the characters have their own voice because we don't edit our speech to be perfect. People speak in informal grammar and dialect and sentence fragments. We use the wrong words. We interrupt ourselves. And sometimes a character's speech is meant to be halting or garbled. I once had a character whose speech was just mumbling, uh, but that was how it was meant to be. Um, However, at the same time, we do want to keep authenticity and conscious language in mind. We don't want speech to devolve into stereotypes. We don't want dialects to be represented so heavily that it's, ridiculous or hard to read. Sometimes we just want to hint at it and say things like he spoke in a Scottish brogue or a Southern drawl, and just let the reader imagine what that sounds like. Some publishers will also insist that you not add dialogue at all and just query any problems that you see. Mechanics of dialogue can be tricky. The number one question for authors and new editors is about um, dialogue tags versus action beats. So a tag is an expression of how something was uttered. So it and the speech form a sentence. So I never said that, comma, she said. That's all one sentence. It's a description of what she said. But I never said that, period. She frowned. Those are two different actions. We don't frown words. So that's two different things, two sentences, capital S, separate sentence. Um, Another common question is in my third example there. I don't understand, she said, comma, and looked away. It's a hot debate over whether we include that comma. Some people just omit it because it makes a comma splice. Yes, it does, but I feel that it's kind of idiomatic that we separate the said from the action that follows it. Again, it's a style choice. Either way is legitimate. See what your author wants, what your publisher wants, and go with that. Um, Also, when you have speech interrupted with action, like in our final sentence here, this is how you punctuate it, by the way, the quotes and then the dashes in between the quotes. Make sure that that opening quote mark after the second dash is turned the correct way because Word will automatically make it the wrong way. So make sure to always fix those. Verbs of utterance should be um, things, again, that describe how things are said. So we want to watch for overuse and underuse of those. Make sure that it's not a constant stream of he said, she said, he said, she said. Context can usually help tell who's talking. This is something you can query if it gets to be a problem. Um, s- and there's a range of viability of dialogue tags. Said and asked are always solid choices. Um, you can scream things, you can wheeze them. You don't shudder words, you don't encourage them. Um, but you can sigh and laugh and hiss, and grumble, grunt. There are different levels of acceptance for those, again, per for each publisher, for each author, for each book. Some are tighter in which ones they'll allow, some are more lax. So always note that on the style sheet as well. Another common point of confusion with dialogue is when dialogue isn't dialogue, and we don't need that comma because it's not actually something being said, it's something being reported or observed. So things that are written, things that you heard someone say, things that are on signs, um, descriptions of things that could be said. And there's more about that in my book as well. Um, we're going to be careful about how we represent accents. Again, the punctuation can represent how it's pronounced, how we're representing sounds, how are we representing slang. Um, are we doing dashes with interruptions versus ellipses for pauses? That's the typical representation, but sometimes people make other choices. We're also going to do some fact versus fiction checking because sometimes they collide with each other. Um, we have bloopers such as pet phrases that appear a lot and they start to really kind of bang around in your mind. You want to call those out because authors have their little pet things that they like to do and they don't know they're doing it. Um, watch for alliteration or rhyming, which may not be intentional. Um, be aware of redundant body parts. What else are you going to nod but your head? You can't shrug your elbow. Um, watch out for smothered verbs like made a decision versus just decided. You don't need all those words in there, just use the verb. Look out for action bloopers, such as red herrings, little plot clues that seem like they're going to lead to something, but they don't go anywhere. Watch out for characters that just drop into scenes without actually walking in or being present, that they're just suddenly there. Um, or when people are, for example, they're in the car and then suddenly they're in the living room, but they didn't get out of the car and actually go into the house. Um, look out for missing scene breaks. Um, and the famous trope, as you know, Bob, when characters sit around telling each other things that they already know about each other just to convey that information to the reader. That's not something you can always handle at the copy editing stage, but it is something you can call out if it gets to be really noticeable. Watch out also for factual bloopers. How do things actually work in life? You can't fall off a building and have a 20-second conversation with the person falling next to you before you land. That just is not a thing. Um, watch for anachronisms such as books or songs or objects that didn't exist in that time period, or words that either didn't exist or would obviously be outdated and people would not talk that way during that time. Um, always fact check your place's style sheet, whether it's factual or fictional, so that make sure that things are laid out as they should be. But again, deliberate obfuscation. Authors sometimes fake it just to proceed, to advance their stories. So be aware of that when you're querying. Um, and just generally how things work. Tech and software is another big one. We don't press send to send an email. You don't click on a phone screen. I always think of if you ever watched The Big Bang Theory, there's a scene where Sheldon is banging on a key on his keyboard to unfriend someone. You don't do that. That's not how that works. That's not how any of this works. So those are things you can call out and help make it accurate. Publishers especially generally want to avoid issues with trademarks. So they may have guidance for you on which trademarks to cap and when. For example, some will cap Google as a noun, but lowercase it as a verb. Here's a list of some that are frequently encountered. Conscious language in fiction. I want to talk briefly about the difference between conscious language, which is about outdated and biased language, inappropriate framing of people or situations or cultural entities, and it affects all areas, whether it might be disability, race, gender, and so on. Authenticity is more about ensuring accurate representation of a particular culture or a particular people or a particular language. And authenticity readers are going to analyze based on their own lived experience. So they're the people you want to consult with, or that the author wants to consult it to make sure that they're representing a particular group accurately and respectfully. So, from a copy editor's point of view, generally we are not going to be the expert, but we do need to be aware of what to look for and what could possibly be a problem. We do want to be aware of the author's background. If they're writing about their own culture, they're the experts. So we generally let them say what they have to say. Um, Bring any problems possibly to your client's attention, like the publisher, especially if it's a larger issue. It may have been something that has already been discussed with the author. Um, it's fine to suggest different wording if possible, but just outright changing characterization or rewriting a scene would be a no-no. Um, and definitely stay up to date on conscious language discussions, whether you follow groups online or consult the resources that are given in the references that I gave you at the beginning of the presentation. Just it's a good idea in these days to just be aware of what's out there and keep learning and keep talking to people. And I learned about a term this weekend that I had never heard of that is a slur. So now I know to look for it. Some specific things to look for are how people are portrayed. What is their language or behavior? Is it stereotypical? Is it offensive? Just because a particular word or slur was used in a historical setting doesn't mean that we need to include it now. Can that idea or sense be expressed in other ways? Um, Look out for unnecessary gendering assumptions, such as talking about having someone's mother pack their lunch or saying that someone looks like a typical guy. What does a typical guy look like? That's definitely a gender assumption we don't need to make. Watch out for otherings, such as referring to certain people as exotic, or a big one is describing skin tones with food metaphors. That's a big no-no. Let's not exotify them or make them objects rather than a person. And we have lots of color terms we can use instead. Watch out for idioms that have inappropriate undertones, like Dutch treat or grandfathering in. Um, Ableist language. Let's not use terms like suffering if it's not actually suffering, or things like an AIDS victim, or saying that someone is wheelchair bound, or the trope that's if someone's disabled, they must be evil. Watch out for things like that. So I'm going to skip over these practice things. They're going to take a little bit of extra time. So I just have some final thoughts, which are just remember to be flexible because fiction does not follow a hidebound set of rules. Each book is its own reference, and each book is a start over and let it be its own guide. Use your spidey sense to notice when things aren't quite right, and call them to the author's attention and let them decide how they want to fix it. Respect those authors' choices, and make sure to serve the readers. Make sure that they are able to experience that story without distractions of errors or, funky phrasing, things like that. And most of all, when you're copying fiction, I just encourage people to have fun. So that's what I have to say. Here's a list of resources again if you want to look those over while we're doing the Q&A. So Shannon, that's what I have.
That's great. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful content so far. We do have lots of questions.
I bet. We usually do.
Yeah. So starting out with Linda, can you discuss the main differences between copy editing and proofreading?
Okay, so in the traditional publishing workflow, copy editing would be you're working on the actual manuscript in Word, um, making editorial changes, making those style decisions. And then once the manuscript is edited, it goes back to the author and probably the publisher, and everyone reviews those edits, your queries. Hopefully they make changes based on those queries, and then that that edited manuscript gets typeset into usually a PDF, and then proofreading would consist of either cold reading that PDF, which means just reading it, or comparing it to the edited manuscript and making sure that all those changes were made correctly, that there are no remaining errors, that it follows the style sheet, which is why you create your style sheet so the proofreader can refer to it. And then the proofreader is also checking things like the layout, the font, looking for spacing errors, making sure that it follows the design, looking for hyphenation problems, things like that. Now, in some many indie and self-publishers often refer to a light final edit as proofreading. Um, so that's why it's really important, as I discussed earlier, to define your scope of work, because technically proofreading is reading that PDF proof against the manuscript or just reading it cold. But generally, we don't proofread in a Word document. Word is for editing, PDF is for proofing. So I hope that clarifies.
Thank you. Next, how can we, as human editors of fiction, keep ahead of AI editing programs to keep from becoming obsolete? You knew this question was coming.
That's a good question, and I do have to admit I am not the person to answer it because I work exclusively for publishers. And all of my publishers are scrambling to introduce, they, in every job offer that I get, there's always a footnote on the email that says, you agree not to put any of our materials through any sort of AI, analysis or generator. I'm not allowed to use AI in my work at all. And they're all adding AI disclaimers to their copyright pages saying that no one else is allowed to use their works to train AI. Um, I mean, again, I'm not the expert. There are other people who know more about it. Um, I'm hoping that it ends up being a lot like when, like back around 2008, when the economy was tanking again. A lot of work went offshore. Um, and oh, it's going to save everyone so much money because people in other countries can do the work so much cheaper. But then they discovered that the quality wasn't quite what they wanted. Um, so a lot of that work ended up coming back. So I'm hoping that, you know, as even as AI develops, I mean, we're still seeing that it's can be terrible. So it's an easy way to generate text, but I don't know that it's generating quality text or accurate text. We're worried about it giving instructions for things that could be dangerous or just really bad idea or just plain inaccurate. Um, yeah,
It's a
it's
complicated question
it
with,
is very complicated, and I'm not the one to address it, I guess.
yeah. Okay, next question would be, many quotation marks affect the visual and cadence of the reading. So Mary Gabrielle is looking for a substitute for quotation marks. Would you have any suggestions, alternative ways of presenting dialogue?
Ah, well, yeah, quotation marks is by far the most common, but there are other ways to do it. Sometimes an author will just use, like, for example, an M dash leading in. Sometimes they just don't have quotation marks at all. Sometimes they just let context do it. Trying to think of what are some other ways I've seen. Those are mainly the two, is just to just, yeah, either dashes or just no quotation marks at all. Just
Hmm.
have the dialogue and then a comma and then the dialogue tag or whatever.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's not an ironclad rule. As with so many things, it's you can do it different ways.
Yeah. Perfect. Next question from Shruti. Hi, Amy. I have your Chicago Guide to Copy Editing Fiction, but am making my way through it much slower than I'd like to. Does all the content in today's session appear in the book, or should I consider this webinar as a supplement?
No, this is very much an overview of what's in the book. So yeah, keep going.
Perfect. Excellent. Um, with changes you catch, for example, over 6 feet tall, under 6 feet tall, do you just bring that to an author's attention, or would you also make a suggestion for what works best?
It kind of depends. Like I had said, if there's only one discrepancy, I would change it and just query it and say, hey, he's 6 feet over 6 feet everywhere else. Is this okay? Or give examples of why I think that change should be made. But if it's really all over the place or it gets really tangled and confusing, I would make notes of, here are the places where it's a problem. Please review this and see what you can do to resolve this.
Perfect. From Amanda, we have, when putting together a style sheet, do you include manuscript page numbers, or do you rely on Control F to find instances in the manuscript later on?
I do not use manuscript page numbers because number one, they can change across systems and with editing and so on. And also, a whole other topic is that I use a template that changes the page numbers altogether, and then I put it back the way the client had it when I return it. So my documents when I work on them have about twice as many pages as the client's original document does because I use a much larger font that is nice for my eyes. So what I use is I use chapter numbers. So it's kind of a combination of the number plus you can search in that chapter so that we know exactly what part you're looking for that's problematic or that's the reference. And also when I'm writing those descriptive phrases on my style sheet, I try to stick to the exact wording as much as possible so that it gives an idea of what to look for, what to find.
Mary Gabrielle also asked, does the author always provide the style sheet? What to do if they provide one?
I have never had an author produce a style sheet. If I get a style sheet, it's from the publisher because that's something that the copy editor generates. The only things I would get from the author would be, for example, if they have those bios or backstory or a glossary, maybe for like a fantasy novel, things that are
Do you ever
already
get
in the
timelines from them too, or?
timelines. I mean, on previous style sheets, sure.
Mm,
Um, but they're generally things like chapter one, here's what happens in chapter one. Chapter two, here's what happens in chapter
okay.
two. I don't get things that say Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on like that, usually.
Judy has asked, local dialect word choices for nonfiction. So this is a very specific question. If an individual is known publicly through social media and speaks with a local dialect, would you change that in a book aimed at a larger audience, or query the author about that?
I would absolutely not change it because that's
Mm,
how the person talks and that's their voice. So no, I would not.
okay. I understand that Canadian spelling uses story, EY versus story, Y, and color, OU versus color, O. Is there a reason why you're using the opposing spellings? Is it a style preference?
You
Somebody's
mean
in,
in my presentation?
yeah, you might have had an example in
Oh,
your slides to show the different kinds of spellings.
yeah. Well, probably because I'm American.
Okay.
And but that raises an interesting point because sometimes I am working in, for example, British English, and I think I usually just use my own preferred spellings on the style sheet. Like if I'm just saying, if I'm describing something that's a certain color, um, I make I follow the style in the manuscript, but in making my notes, I wouldn't use the British spellings.
Mm,
I don't think I usually do. Yeah, because that's like an internal document. It's not actually live being produced in the manuscript.
right.
So,
Someone actually commented, I'm going to share this with you because it's interesting relating to the style sheet question. So Stephen Graham Jones created a mini character style sheet for the Buffalo Hunter. I'm not sure if it's duplicated, but because he used different grammar rules for each character and the copy editor messed it up. So then he had to
mhm.
create the style sheet to fix it. So that's maybe like one of the edge cases where an author actually came in and made a style sheet. We have reached 2 p.m. We do have more questions. Do you want to keep going for a few more minutes to answer the last few questions that we have?
Sure, sure. I'm
All
happy
right,
to stay.
perfect. Judy has asked, Amy, do you submit your timeline in addition to the style
Oh,
sheet to the
yes.
author?
Oh,
Okay,
yes. It's absolutely part of the style sheet. That's part of my work product. So it goes to them. It can be very helpful. Yep, absolutely.
perfect. Can you talk about encountering difficult or inappropriate content, depictions, stereotypes in the copy editing process, and how would you might flag that or address these with the author or publishing or
Hmm.
publisher?
Yeah. That and again, that's a whole section in the book as well. I've got a whole chapter on conscious language. Basically, it depends on the depth of the problem. Um, if it's more deeply ingrained, I would bring it up with my contact rather than directly with the author. If it's just a matter of a problematic term, I've got a bunch of standard queries that I have for different terms. um, I would bring up my query and suggest changes for it. um, But if it's a whole problem with a characterization, I would definitely bring it up with the client again, because that may have been discussed earlier. They may have decided it's okay. They may not be aware of it at all. And I've had a range of things. I've had them say, "Oh gosh, I didn't know that. Yeah, I better fix that." And I've had them say, "Oh no, it's no big deal." And in cases like that, you just have to say, "Well, I tried. I did my due diligence. It's not my book. If that's how they want it, I've done what I can, and
Hmm.
it's their name on the cover, so
Yeah.
them's the breaks.
And the breaks. Yeah.
I tried."
Linda's asked, when querying, is that just a tracked question or do you reach out to the publisher or author?
No, those are all directly in the manuscript. So whether each publisher has different preferences, whether it's a word comment or if it's usually word comments, but sometimes it's like double brackets within the text with highlighting in bold to make it stand out, that kind of thing, so that it's easy to search and find them and delete them later.
Perfect. And would you include the Canadian style or editing Canadian English as good resources?
That I'm Again, it depends on what your client prefers. I
Mm,
believe that Chicago is generally
yeah.
used throughout Canada mostly, but there may be some clients or individual authors who want to follow Canadian style,
Yeah. So you always have to
the
double
Canadian
check with
style
your
guide.
author or
Yeah,
publisher. Yeah.
yeah.
Let me see here. Could you comment on using quotes? For example, famous quotes at the start of chapters or sections in fiction. Do you contain them in quotation marks or have other special formatting or style suggestions?
Chicago style says no quotes. So that's generally what my clients want, and that's what we do. I don't think anybody's ever said, no, you have to have the quotes. It's a standalone line, and then usually an M dash below with the source.
Okay. Next, I have from Victoria. I was trained in magazine editing, substantive, line, and then copy editing. Then at a traditional publisher, we had all three stages. But now that I'm freelance, especially through organizations like Readsy, there's no such thing as line editing. So does that become a part of substantive editing or copy editing? Any thoughts on line editing versus copy editing? Am I imagining line editing happens?
Right. Um, I have never specifically offered line editing as a service. I'm strictly copy editing and proofreading. That said, I do have one client that sends me, I'm doing a couple of series for them, that one of them really needed line editing, and they sent it to me as a copy edit. And I got into it. I'm like, wow, like it needed like rewriting in some places. And I was like, you guys, do you want me to really go at this, or do you want me to just, buff it with whatever copying I can do? And they're like, oh yeah, we forgot to tell you that really needs a heavier edit. So go to town and here's your higher rate to compensate for that. So yeah, there are some in that one, there are some phrases where passages where I just have to say, okay, I think I know what they're trying to say, so I just rewrite the whole thing. And I'm on like something like the sixth book in the series, so I think they like what I'm doing.
Perfect. There you go. Okay, next question from Eva. There's a lot of work here with checking many things, producing a detailed style sheet, and sometimes writing detailed queries. Can you say something about typical editing speeds for fiction?
That I cannot. I know that my speed tends to be faster for several reasons. Number one, my general reading speed has always been fast, so therefore my editing reading speed, although slower, is generally faster than the typical rates that I see. Um, Fiction does tend to be a little bit faster page rate than nonfiction because it's generally smoother. There's not a lot of, like, you don't have a bibliography to deal with, and there's not a million organization names to check and things like that. Um, it is such an individual thing. I can't really say, well, you should be editing this many pages or that many pages. It's good though to find your groove. And what I actually do, I keep a spreadsheet that shows for all my past jobs what was my speed on this job, so that when I get the next one for that same author or a similar book from the same client, I kind of can budget my time and figure out how long it's going to take me, what's the bill going to be, and so on.
That's good advice. That's really good advice. Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one more, and it's a very general one from Kirsten, sorry. Do you have any advice for someone just getting into editing and not sure where to get started?
Okay, well, that's where you would go to the resources list. Like I said, that's all. Those are all. I'm definitely get the Copy Editor's Handbook. Um, Go to Catherine O'More Clough's Copy Editor's Knowledge Base, and her name and that title is enough to get you there. It's on her website. Um, Tons of resources there. Keep following your editorial associations like Editors Canada, ACES in the United States, EFA, the Editorial Freelancers Association. Um, get Aaron's book if you want to do fiction. Get my book. Um, that will keep you busy for a long time.
Read
If you
all the books.
read all the books, it's I don't want to reinvent the wheel. There's so much just scads of information out there. There's lots of great courses out there.
I would also add
Yeah,
join those social media groups. There's a
yeah,
couple on Facebook. There's some popping up on Discord now too, LinkedIn. It's
yep,
another good place to just go and read what people are saying, what other editors are exchanging on, because you
yep,
can learn a lot from sometimes people put in, I'm not sure what to do with this. Can somebody help? And you get all kinds of
yep.
different perspectives and answers and a lot of expertise behind them as well and explanations.
Yep.
So that's
And
another
like, and
way.
especially like on Blue Sky and places like that, go follow a couple of big names, like some of the people who are on this list. Follow who they follow, follow who follows them,
Yeah.
and find those groups. On Facebook, you've got the Editors Association of Earth. There's the Editors Back Room, and in there they'll have resource lists. Again, it's just you go there and a whole bunch of stuff pops out. They'll have lists of other groups you can join and so on. Um, so yeah, there's just a million things out there that will help you get started.
Yeah. All right, well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you everyone for attending. Really appreciate all the questions and the interaction in the chat was great. Amy, thank you again for joining us. A reminder to all our attendees, you will get a recording as well as all the Q&A that's been answered. They'll be included in the recording. And you'll get a survey to evaluate the webinar. Please do complete it. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Take care.
All right, thank you, everyone.